what I'd like to do is go back to a text which you hopefully are getting right now, and build on that text in order to make some sense of what might be described as traditional Jewish attitudes toward dress and adornment and the relationship of dress and adornment toward gender and sexuality. That's what I just said is correct. It's also a little bit too broad. So what I'd like to do is begin by sharing with you how I came to focus on this material. And then we're going to do some studying together. And I really do mean for this to be interactive, which is why I asked for the lapel mic so I could walk around and we could talk to one another as we study this text. And then as we begin to formulate some interpretations of the text, there are some other texts that I'd like to add to it that I think will help to fill the picture out. Many of you know, I'm sure, that gender studies became a field of its own in a real full-fledged way and was very, very popular au courant and really cutting edge in the academy, in universities back in the 70s, late 70s, 80s, I think is when it emerged as a very, very popular academic field. And typically, Jewish studies lagged a little bit behind, but we did our best to learn from what was going on in the academy and catch up. And so during that period, during the 80s and into the early 90s, there were many very, very good publications, many of them relating to questions of Judaism and gender and sexuality. And those of you who know what I'm talking about, meaning there was some really excellent work, and it really opened our eyes to a lot of things that we had probably not noticed before. At the same time, but in a way that didn't connect to gender and sexuality studies, at least in Jewish studies, there was a turn of attention to the importance of material culture in general. And I think it's fair to say that one very important subset of material culture is what the subject of this conference has been. That is to say, dress and adornment and the like. This has always been potentially a very, very serious subject for study, but I have to say that at the time that gender studies were very, very popular and cutting edge, for reasons that leave me kind of baffled, no one in Jewish studies looked to the possible advantage, understood the possible advantage, of carefully examining what Jewish sources had to say, at least in the pre-modern period. I mean, there was some attention to this as far as modern Jewry was concerned, but with respect to pre-modern Judaism or Judaisms, there was very little attention paid, and that includes the text that I've just handed out that I hope all of you have a copy of. If you don't, look around. There are certainly plenty of copies of it. This is, as you'll see, a text which, as we'll kind of unpack it over the course of our session today, has an enormous amount to teach about gender and sexuality from a traditional Jewish perspective. And when I use that phrase, I want to be very, very careful. Traditional Jewish perspective is just going to be my lazy way of saying from traditional Talmudic sources, which obviously are extremely influential in the way Judaism develops over the ages, but there are many traditional Judaisms, many approaches to these things. So I want to avoid a monolithic picture while recognizing that what we are about to see is truly foundational in the fullest sense of the term. Just one more word of introduction, and then we'll begin our study. When I turned to this text, when I recognized that it was a very promising text, and yet it had been neglected, I happened at that point to have, as a kind of conversation partner, a young woman who was both in rabbinical school here at the Jewish Theological Seminary and herself had a PhD in philosophy and actually had taught at the university level philosophy. She was coming back to study to be a rabbi because of a turn in her own identity and her own life at the time. And so she and I worked on this together. I took special responsibility for the Jewish sources. She took special responsibility for some of the theory. And shortly after we began working together, though we had been conversation partners for a long time, she unfortunately became ill. And she died of her cancer not too long after discovering that. So this is work that was, just kind of too loaded for me to approach. Since we were working together on it, it was too difficult for me to pursue it for a very, very long time. I finally came back to it more recently when it's actually, formulated as a chapter for a festschrift, for a volume honoring a particular scholar. But I owe some, at least, of the insights that I have to this woman. So I just wanted to indicate that by way of introduction as well. So if you will, take this page that I hope you all have a copy of, and let me give you a little bit of the essential background to make sense of what's on the page here. It comes from, as you can see, this is a two-sided sheet that you should have there. It comes from the Mishnah, which is the earliest of the canonical rabbinic works, often but not fully correctly described as the first expression of rabbinical law. It's more than law, but it is also that. And this is taken from Tractate Shabbat, which is the rabbi's first formulation of the Sabbath law according to the understanding of rabbinic Judaism. Now, you might immediately wonder, what do fashion and ornament have to do with Sabbath observance? The answer is, actually, after you'll see this, it'll be pretty obvious to those of you who know something about Sabbath observance in the traditional rabbinic mode. It all relates to the question of carrying. One of the categories of prohibited labor, according to actually the full history of Jewish Sabbath prohibitions, which the rabbis accept, but this goes back to biblical times as well, is that an observant Jew is not permitted to carry outside on the Sabbath. There are certain modifications of this, certain techniques which make carrying possible in the rabbinic age, but the prohibition at least stands on the books. So no carrying outside. The question then becomes, what counts as carrying or not? Right now I'm wearing clothes, you're wearing clothes. Does wearing count as carrying? If wearing counted as carrying, then your alternative would be to stay in all day on the Sabbath, never to go outside at all, or to go outside naked, right? Because you're not allowed to carry outside. Now, fortunately, in the judgment of the rabbis and others, wearing was not judged to be carrying, right? So you can wear things while not carrying things. Now the question becomes, so what do we wear and what do we carry? Certain things, at least in their judgment, were relatively obvious. Those things with which we cover ourselves, we drape ourselves. Okay, that's wearing. The purpose of that is both protection and modesty, so that's easy. What about ornamentation? What about ornamentation? And here you get into a complicated discussion because you could argue that if you take a pin, a ring, a headdress, whatever it might be, and you put it on, if it's not essential, if it doesn't cover you or protect you from the elements, maybe this is not clothing in the Sabbath sense, and if it's not clothing, if you don't wear it, then it counts as carrying, and therefore you would not be able to wear ornamentation on the Sabbath. That at least would have been one possible outcome, but the rabbis also judge that bona fide jewelry ornament counts as being worn and not carried. You can therefore wear it out on the Sabbath, but then things get a little bit more complicated. Okay? So if you were to carry something, prohibited, and if you did it outside, there would be a penalty. If you wear something, permitted, And if you wear it outside, no penalty because you're wearing it and not carrying it. They do have a middle category, though, and you need this to make sense of this text. They're also afraid, rabbis being rabbis, they're also afraid that there's certain things you might want to show your friends and neighbors because you're so happy about them, you're so proud of them. Look at this ring I have. Look at this beautiful pin that I have. Look at this, headdress that I have, that my husband bought me, last week. I'd like to show it to you. And there the fear was certain things might be removed in order to be shown. And if you remove them, you might then carry them, right? If you have them on, they're being worn. If you remove them and walk a very short distance, that counts as carrying. And that would be prohibited if you carried. But in order to avoid that danger, the rabbis, again being rabbis, said things where there is such a danger, you should not wear outside on the Sabbath. But if you wear them outside on the Sabbath, there's no penalty. Okay, so that's the middle category. That's the background to the Mishnah we have here. I'm going to read through it quickly. And as I read it, pay attention to both the overall structure of the Mishnah, the rhetoric of the Mishnah, as it were, as well as the specifics of what are being discussed. So, Mishnah number 1. With what may a woman go out, and with what may she not go out? A woman should not go out with strands of wool, nor strands of flax, nor with straps upon her head. Then a parenthetical statement, nor with a totefet, we don't know what that is, nor with sanbutin, when they are not sewn on, nor with a hairnet to the public domain, nor with a city of gold. City of gold were crowns that new brides would wear, a kind of very, very obvious jewelry headdress. Nor with a necklace, nor with nose rings, nor with a ring which has no seal upon it, nor with a needle which has no hole. And if she went out wearing any of these things, she is not liable. She is not liable. So, if she's not liable, what does it tell us about these things? They do count as jewelry, and the reason women are not supposed to go out wearing these things is what? Because they're afraid that she might remove it and show it, or it might fall off and she would carry it, or that kind of thing. Okay, so that's Mishnah number 1. Mishnah number 2. A man should not go out with sandals studded with nails, nor with a single sandal when he has no wound on his foot, nor with tefillin, nor with an amulet. A tefillin, for those of you who don't know, are the prayer straps that men wear for, not actually in their time for prayer, but they come to be associated with prayer, nor with an amulet when it is not from an expert, nor with a coat of mail, nor with a helmet, nor with metal leggings. And if he went out, he is not liable to sin offering, is the way the Mishnah describes these things. So what are these things? What category do they fall into? Well, it's hard to call them ornament, at least all of them, although some of them might be ornament, right? So which ones might be ornament? Right, amulet for sure. What else? Well, tefillin, depending upon how you see tefillin. It's an interesting suggestion. We'll come back to that. What else? Right, coat of mail, helmet, and metal leggings. Obviously, these are seen as adornments for men. What makes them adornment? Well, they're not essential on the one hand, that's true, right? But what makes them, in the positive sense, adornments? Well, the shiny might be part of it. What else? They decorate the man, right? They express something about the man and the qualities in the way ornament does in general, right? It makes a statement. It's something, in other words, to be interpreted. And we'll have a lot more to say about that going forward. But these are ornaments. Interestingly, here there are other things which are obviously not ornaments. Sandals studded with nails has a weird story behind it. Single sandal when he has no wound on his foot, would seem to be connected to what? What's the fear here? Right, a sandal's obviously clothing and not ornament in their view of things. Right, so what's the fear of going out with one? You'll take it off because you're, stepping unevenly. So someone might be very, very poor and have only one good sandal and use it when he can. But then, of course, it's going to become uncomfortable, so he'll remove it. So he'll go barefoot for a while and then perhaps put it back on. If he has a wound on his foot, meaning on one of the feet, then it's obviously okay. At least that's what's suggested here. What's an amulet and what's it for? Good. So some of this is protection and therefore boundedness of the body. Good. What else? Social body. Okay, we'll come back to that. That's good. What about it? Let's say another word about amulet. What were uses of amulets? And the rabbis, when they talk about amulets by an expert versus amulets not by an expert, these are related, but they have very specific things in mind. Yes? It's not for worship, although it is related possibly to worship. Yeah? Exactly. So they're concerned if it's not by an expert, it's not going to work for protection. It comes back to the protection observation. Typically, amulets were seen either as protection or for healing or both, right? And so that's what's being discussed here. We'll come back to these things. It's worth noticing the difference, well, I should start, the overlap or similarities between the list of Mishnah 2 and Mishnah number 1, as well as the differences. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah, we would call it a pin. You know, like if you stick, you know, that's if you stick it into a garment. Right. Say that again? Then it's actually a tool. It's used for sewing. That's exactly right. Right. Mishnah number 3. A woman should not go out with a needle that has a hole, talk about, right? Nor with a ring which has a special seal on it, nor with a cochlea-shaped headdress, nor with a spice charm, nor with a flask of spikenard oil. And if she went out, she is liable to bring a sin offering. That is liable is a very clear indication that these things are not considered to be what? Right? They are not ornament. They have other functions. We could discuss what they are. Now you can see there's an argument here over some of them, right? These are the words of Rabbi Meir, but the sages exempt her from liability in the case of spice charm, right? If it were worn, if you can imagine, on a chain or something around a neck where it would be carried, it could also be an ornament. That at least is the argument here. Needle with a hole is obviously a tool which is used for sewing. Ring with a seal on it would be used in business, although there are other possible associations here, and then the others are a little bit more mysterious, at least to our cultural place. Mishnah 4. A man should not go out with a sword, nor with a bow, nor with a shield, nor with a lance, nor with a spear. Remember, not go out, all of this means on the Sabbath. During the week, it would be fine. Right? And if he did go out, he is liable to bring a sin offering. This, at least, is the first opinion. Now, the one who says he is liable to bring a sin offering, the meaning is what? Therefore, these things are tools or the like and not adornment, but Rabbi Eliezer says they are adornments for him, and thus there is no liability. The sages argue about that and say, no, they are none other than a reproach. The Hebrew word, for those of you who have the Hebrew, is ganai, for it says, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation. A beautiful justification for the alternative opinion. What's interesting here is that it complicates the picture a little bit. The fact that these are on the edge suggests, if you go up to Mishnah 2, you can also see armor as being an ornament for a man. So why aren't these ornaments? Evidently, they're not ornaments because of the relationship between their spirit, right, the purpose for the use of spears and javelins and the like, and the spirit of the Sabbath. Right? That, at least, is the way the argument's set up in Mishnah 4. We'll go on. Mishnah 5. A woman may go out with bands of hair, whether they are made from hers or from her neighbor's or from an animal. We would call those hair pieces. Or with a totefet, or with sanbutin when they are sewn, so there's no danger, they're woven into her hair and therefore no danger of being taken off, with a hairnet or with a wig to the courtyard, with a wool pad in her ear, or with a wool pad in her sandal, right? All of these are permitted, or with a wool pad which she has affixed for her period, with a peppercorn, or with a grain of salt, or with anything that she puts in her mouth, provided that she doesn't place it there to begin with on the Sabbath. Okay, so all of these things she's permitted to go out with, And the permission is without restriction. In other words, they're not afraid that they might be removed and so forth. What kinds of things do we see here included in the list of Mishnah 5? Right, it's not so easy to put them in a single category, but what kinds of things do you see? How would you categorize them? So part of it is, hair, wigs, or the like, which I think would probably be called part of adornment. What else? Okay, well, they are very bodily. I would call that step 2 of interpretation, right? Let's stick with the kind of surface of it, but I think you're exactly right. They are notably very, very bodily. Let's come back to that point. What else do you see here? Yes? Well, they're all worn or at least placed in the body, right, in certain ways. Some are medicinal or healing. Others are just adornment, right? That's where the Mishnah actually mixes up categories. The only thing that unifies the list in here is that they might all be gone out with on the Sabbath without restriction. So either for health, right, or for healing, or for adornment. Are we missing anything there? Yeah, peppercorn and salt is for healing abscesses, sores inside the mouth, is the way it was understood. I don't know whether it works or not, but, ancient medicine, probably not so ancient medicine as well, had it in this way. Okay, so these are the 5. Now, a lot of interpretive things have already been seen, but I think that we actually have to, there's a lot of levels of this that can be interpreted. Yes?
It says that she may not go out to the courtyard.
Mm-hmm. No, it says she can go out to the courtyard. Only into the courtyard. That's right. That level is more restricted. It doesn't allow her to go all the way out to the public domain. But remember, the rabbis, right? The rabbis prohibited you from going to the courtyard out of fear of going to the public domain, unless you set up what some of you will know this word, others of you won't, in a roof, right? Unless you created this common domain by way of a fiction. And so you're right in noticing that, and it's important, but for present purposes, it may be more about where women should be going out at all. Okay, we'll come back to that. Yes?
In Mishnah 1, it says a woman should not go out with her Sabbath. In Mishnah 5, that she can.
The question is whether they're sewn or not. Different kinds of totafet. If it's not sewn, then she can't. If it is sewn, then she can. That's about just the physics of it, as it were. Is it likely to be removed or not? In other words. Okay, now let's begin just with the simple structure of the Mishnah. There are a lot of details that need to be noticed here as well, and some of this has already been noticed, but one of the most obvious things that structures this chapter of Mishnah, one case after the other, is what? Alternating male-female. Right? Very, very striking. This is the most prominent piece of the rhetoric. Female, male, female, male, female. Right? This is very, very clear and distinct categories. Right? Now, let me ask it as a question. I want to come to some of the details. But is this because, they're just simply different things that men and women might wear, might adorn with, might go out with? Is that the explanation for these clear categories here? Be careful. What do you think? Is that the explanation or not? Of course, if it is, then there's not a lot to say. If women do this and men do that, then okay, that might be interesting, but it's not terribly interesting. So the question is whether this Mishnah, in its structuring, in its rhetorical division of men and women, is just interesting or terribly interesting. Okay? So what do you think? Is it because this is just what women go out with and this is what men go out with? Yes? I think that is the Mishnah's rhetorical way of setting up the categorical division. Yes, I agree with you. The question is why it's then not repeated under Mishnah number 2, right? With what may a man go at, right? My recollection is actually there's some manuscripts of the Mishnah where it is. I would have to check. I'm not sure. I think that reinforces the division that we've already noticed. Yeah.
I don't know if this is taking it a step too far.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is, this
Okay, so one of the questions here is, what if each wears of the other? That, of course, is implied in my question. Is this just what women go out and what men go out? Is it by definition the case, as far as the rabbis are concerned, that what might be adornment for a man is not adornment for a woman, and vice versa? You've got it exactly right, at least as far as the rabbinic commentaries on this are concerned. We'll get to that in a little bit. Let's stick to the overall, come back to my question about, is this just the reality being described here, or is there something else going on here? So, is this merely the reality of what men wear and what women wear, what men adorn with and what women adorn with, or is there something else happening here, and how do you know? Exactly right. Exactly. Any other thoughts? Okay, let me ask you. Who wears sandals, men or women? Good. Who puts peppercorns in their mouth or soy when they've got a sore? Both. Who puts cotton in their ears when their ears are oozing? Both, right? What's obvious when you look at this Mishnah is that it is not simply a description of what men or women wear or don't wear, because there are obvious details in the categorization that actually resist the categorization. And it would have been very easy to actually structure this Mishnah by saying, with what may women go out, with what may men go out, and then with what may people go out or not go out, as the case, because there are obviously certain things here that have nothing to do with gender distinction. Right, in reality, in the real world. And so this actually comes back to your observation of rabbinic approval, or why are certain things assigned to men and not to women, and why are certain things assigned to women and not to men, where part of that answer is the social historical reality, but that doesn't answer the whole thing. It can't possibly, because of the details that are suggested here. So let's go, because someone already mentioned it, to Mishnah 5. Right, which are the things that a woman may go out with without restriction. And notice how complicated this one is, because the first part comes right back to women's ornamentation, and the second part has nothing to do with ornamentation at all. One of those details, that is to say, the equivalent of a sanitary napkin, is obviously gender specific, but otherwise it's not. Otherwise, it's not. So what do we make of this? Who made the comment about? Okay. So could you repeat your observation?
In Mishnah 5, all of the objects listed are very, very connected to the body.
Yes, very connected to the body, and in their way, very private or internal, literally internal.
So what that suggests to me is that because menstruation is a female category, that then leads into, okay, so then these are the things that you might wear close to your body in order to prevent oozing, which does not necessarily have to be female specific, but because that's a category we know in the female world, that's where it goes.
And men don't experience those things?
No, but I'm saying that that's a category that we're accustomed to associating with women, and that's going to be. I'm learning Nina this year, so that's for me the obvious question: can a woman go out with a sanitary pad? So then you're thinking, oh, things oozing from the body. That's something that we associate with women.
Okay. So we do associate with them, but my question would then be, when the rabbis think of women as people whose bodies ooze, right, and who then also you've got to worry about those oozings, which are internal oozings, which you've got to take certain precautions against, despite the fact that men might ooze as well and have precisely these same concerns. What does this tell us about the rabbis and their construction of the categories as they imagine women and men? Right? As they imagine women and men. These are not merely descriptive historical social realities. Something more is going on here. There are, as you say, associations. So the question then we have to ask is, what are the associations to the things that are being described here? There were certain beginning interpretations that were suggested before, but now we can go back over the details and actually do it a little bit more comprehensively. Did you want to?
Well, just because I was then curious of why these were in Mishnah Shabbat and not in Midah, because obviously perhaps the population that they think that they're dealing with is different, and therefore they put it in Shabbat
No, because it comes up. I mean, this is not about menstruation as such. It comes up because the question is, what can you go out with on the Sabbath? But that observation, right, what you can go out on the Sabbath, provides an opportunity to discuss something else. What I would suggest, in other words, is that what we see in this Mishnah is not merely a discussion of Sabbath law, though it is that, and it's not merely a discussion of social historical reality, though it is that. Right? It is also an imagination, a construction, as it were, right? Which builds on associations of what are women and what are men, and this very strict categorical differentiation, the rhetorical differentiation between men, women, women, men, women, women, men. This is very, very important here because it suggests, in fact, that when you discuss in connection to one, you can't discuss in connection to the other, despite the fact that self-evidently you can. Right? That's what's so kind of surprising about this, that you can discuss several of the details here in connection to both, and yet they refuse to do so. That I take to be meaningful. So let's go back over what is associated with women and what is associated with men and how we might interpret that. I invite all suggestions. Shall we begin with what's associated with women here? Okay, so the body is number one, right? And internality, oozing, which we've already said. What else? Yes? And how do you know that? No, but from here I'm asking, how do you know it? So, I mean, you're absolutely right that that's suggested here, but I'm asking what you're noticing. Just from living life. Okay, others we want to, yes. Could you speak up so that I can hear?
When you look at the different mishnahs, you're speaking of warring tools, instruments that you could go out to protect for war.
Right.
That's male, that's associated with male.
Mm-hmm.
And then it speaks of the feminine because of hair, the adornment of hair. So it speaks in two different ways of masculine and feminine.
Adornment means something radically different. One, this is why I was kind of pushing you a little bit, one symbolizes protection, right? Whether a man wearing these things protects anybody is beside the point, right? I mean, he can wear all the swords he wants. He may never have drawn it in any practical context, right? It is genuinely adornment. And that's perfectly clear from the discussion of can you, the sword on the Sabbath. So it advertises, it states something with respect to the man and his maleness, right, which is obviously about protective public social quality, social public protection. The reason I asked you actually was, where does it say he protects his woman? I assume he does. Right, but it's not obvious to me from the details here that that's the first function. It would be one of many functions of these things. What else? So let's, if you, male or female, yes.
So it seems to me that when a man moves onto the foot, he wears a cap. So what if that's a woman on the foot? She puts a wool cap in her cap. I guess she's much more delicate.
I think you're catching on to something very important there. The assumption is that she's much more delicate. Good. What else? Yes. Well, is she the one who's nurturing others, or is she the one who needs to be healed and nurtured, if we read it that way? Both. Okay, good. Interesting. Others. Yes.
Well, if you go to Mishnah 2,
Go ahead.
somehow they include Philip, which is weekday, which is also associated with prayer.
Uh-huh.
It's also associated with the positive command, what a man has to do.
So there, what's inappropriate about it is the Sabbath as opposed to the weekday, right, and its particular quality. What's interesting there is why mention it at all then?
Exactly.
Right? So why mention it at all? Why draw attention to tefillin since tefillin is so self-evidently not part of Sabbath practice?
Very masculine.
Okay, good.
Positive command.
And we'll say more about that. Good, yes. Could you speak up a little? Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Right. Mm-hmm.
They seem to be both having protection.
They are protection, but they're very different kinds of protection, right? The way they relate to the body, which is one of the things, the way they seem to be caring, right, are very, very different. That at least is what's been suggested up to this point. I mean, it makes sense to me. What else? Yes? Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, although it's interesting what you're saying, and this is the social reality, but it goes beyond the social reality. The fact that the tools that are associated with the woman and being tools, what you work with, are inappropriate for the Sabbath, happen to be precisely those tools that what? Think about what you just described. They relate to what are characteristically in that world so-called women's work, right? That very, very obviously, yes. No. No, I don't believe that's true at all. I think it's very clear that a man could do these things just as a woman could do these things, which makes the question, the interesting question, so why associate it only with women? Since it's obviously talking about both. You know, no one ever draws that conclusion in all of the interpretive tradition. The assumption is that these being medicinal can be used equally by men and by women, which, again, coming back to the way you rephrase the question, is what makes it so interesting that here they are associated with women. I think the best interpretation is the one that's already been suggested, which is that it comments on the quality of women woman who she is, what her needs are, the nature of her needs, and so forth. If you think about it, just to generalize, and let's talk now about ornament and attraction, right? Because ornament is obviously also related to attraction, right? So there are ornaments that men wear and there are ornaments that women wear. What is the nature, according to this Mishnah, of a woman's attraction, and what is the nature of a man's attraction? Right? Or another way of saying that is what makes a woman an attractive woman and what makes a man an attractive man. Yes?
It seems to me that the man's ornament is something that he does something.
Mm-hmm.
It's an active thing. The woman's ornament is totally passive.
Okay, so active and passive. What other distinctions would you draw, Bonnie?
Yeah, the man's are about power and economic, and what they're bringing in. The women is all about her personal decoration.
Yeah, it's decorating the woman, more beauty, right? So one is about power and economics, social place, that's the activity, versus passive and attractive, again, in the passive sense, decorating in that sense. Good. Other ways of kind of describing the dichotomy? Yes? Functional and non-functional, also a good way to describe it. Okay, all of these things I think are true. They're related ways of describing, but all very, very good ways of capturing. Does this tell us about the construction of maleness and the construction of femaleness according to the rabbis? I'm going to press it a little bit further. Okay, now, I began with the word attraction, interestingly. So the question is, what is attractive about? And we've just said some things about it. What's interesting is that there is at least some doubt whether a woman's adornments are meant to provide public attraction at all, according to the rabbis. Okay? Are these meant to be public at all? So, there is unfortunately a somewhat later midrash being rabbinic, kind of expansion upon Scripture. For those of you who know it, this is from a midrash called the Tanhuma, which talks about the biblical figure Dinah, who was known for, going out into public for, and some trouble on account of that. And on that connection, in connection to that story, The Midrash quotes this Mishnah that we've just been studying, right, and adds the following statement, right? So this Mishnah is about what you're permitted to go out on the Sabbath and not permitted to go out on the Sabbath. The Midrash adds the following comment, quote, even during the week, she is prohibited from going out with them, meaning a woman is not only forbidden to go out on the Sabbath with the jewels listed here, but she's forbidden to go out during the week with the jewels listed here because everyone will look at her. Because everyone will look at her. For adornments were only given to a woman that she might adorn herself in her home. The assumption is, in other words, that jewelry, adornment for a woman is what? An attraction only in the privacy of her own home for her husband, right? In the privacy of her own home, right, for her husband. Now, this gets expanded in very interesting ways. Here I'm going to add some texts that you don't have, and then we'll put this all together as our discussion goes on. Someone already mentioned the possibility, or at least the question, of a man dressing in a woman's adornments or garments and a woman in a man's. Many of you know, perhaps you all know, that there is a prohibition of cross-dressing in the Torah. I should quote the translation. This is Deuteronomy chapter 22. The garment of a man should not be upon a woman, nor should a man wear the clothing of a woman, for despised by the Lord your God are all those things. And on that, the Midrash, another Midrash, this is a very early Midrash, for those of you who are keeping historical count, says the following. Okay? And what does Scripture come to teach us? What is the purpose, in other words, of the commandment that I just read the translation of? That a woman should not wear a white garment and a man should not cover himself in colored garments? Now that's interesting, isn't it? Right? Because the first thing this obviously assumes is that what? Men wear white and that women wear colors, right? Coming back to the discussion, the first discussion, how do colors work or not work in this whole thing, right? So a man wears white because there's no need for him to be, kind of flashy, attractive, things like women, on the other hand, would wear colors because evidently again, the larger discussion of a female attraction, right? So is that what this scripture means to teach? Scripture says despised. That is to say, things that lead to despised acts. In other words, the rabbis understand the Torah's prohibition to be in place only where you act on it, not where you, cross-dress, right, which might be okay, as long as the cross-dressing doesn't lead to bad things. So now listen to the way it expresses it. So this is the general rule. A woman should not dress like a man dresses and go amongst men. And a man should not adorn himself in the adornments of women and go amongst women. And then they go on to another discussion, okay? So on the first level, this simply says that, yes, the Torah doesn't like cross-dressing, but it doesn't get really anxious about it unless you use it for sinful purposes. But the way this is expressed is very interesting. Listen to the language again. A woman should not dress, the verb there in the Hebrew, for those of you who have the Hebrew, is lavash, litlabesh, like a man dresses to go amongst men, and a man should not adorn, right, with the adornments of women to go amongst women. The language is very suggestive here. What do men do? Men dress. What do women do? Women adorn. Okay? Even the verbs that are used to describe what each gender, right, sex does are different, right? So the way we cover ourselves is different in that sense. To carry it a little bit further. Okay, now adornment and sexuality. And I'm going to share just a few sources with you. You'll see the way it comes back to the discussion of intimacy that we had before. So, first of all, adornment in general has obvious connections to sexuality, and the rabbis are very focused, meaning very aware of this association, and suggest its meaningfulness in a number of ways. So, for example, they believe that Moses' wife, Tzipporah, at one time during her life, I actually don't remember what the source of this observation is, that she didn't wear the adornments of women. Okay, so Moses' wife, Tzipporah, didn't wear the adornments of women, and this is taken as evidence that she and Moses were not having sex. I think mentioned earlier was the notion that when jewelry be removed, actually in the discussion of hair covering and the exposure of a woman's hair, there too, this suspected woman suspected of adultery, which is the source of that discussion in the Mishnah, her jewelry is to be removed. And the removal of jewelry, the very point of that is to render her repulsive. Okay, that's the language is used. Take your jewelry off, that renders her repulsive. And then, by contrast, going the other way, the assumption made in the Midrash talking about the Joseph story when Joseph is in Egypt is that Joseph was not exactly the righteous person that he is sometimes described as being, and that merely seeing Egyptian women wearing their jewelry was enough to excite his lust and passion. That is the association of adornment and sexuality, at least on the first level. Now it goes further, according to the rabbis. There is a description for both men and women of what are described as outward or public adornments and private adornments. Okay, what we've seen in the Mishnah of Shabbat are what might be described as public adornments, right, in obvious ways. So what are private adornments? Here I'm not going to read full text, but give you references for those of you who want to check up on me. The first, so the question, I'm going to begin with women's private adornments, according to the rabbis. There is a description in both the Babylonian and the Palestinian Talmuds. These are the rabbinic expansions on the Mishnah, two separate traditions thereof. And the question is asked, what are the adornments of a woman? And here it's not expressed as private adornments, but just in general. What are the adornments of a woman? Answer, I quote, she dresses her hair, applies eye coloring, removes unwanted hair, trims her hair and nails, and passes a potsherd over her face. Okay? Dresses her hair, applies hair coloring, removes unwanted hair, trims her hair and nails, and passes a potsherd over her face. So this is, kind of personal care for a woman, as the rabbis describe it. What would a potsherd accomplish? It's obviously, shaving or its equivalent. And what is being described here is? Exfoliation where? Yeah, except that's not the way either of the Talmuds understands it, right? Because panim here, face, means, they're not actually assuming that you have to worry about a woman's beard. Both Talmuds understand this to be shaving of the vulva. Okay, it's removal of genital hair. And so the assumption being made, again, in both Talmudic contexts, is that part of a woman's adornment is to render herself, to the extent possible, hairless, including genital hair. Okay, that's in both of the Talmuds. In addition, a woman will also have, according to the Talmud, other inner jewels. One of them is, both of these are odd words, but it's very clear what they mean in context. One would be supportive mold for breasts, okay, which in that world was not necessarily taken for granted as it is in ours, and protective molds for women's genitalia, for the vagina. And they go on now to describe how these things will be worn, who will see them, and so forth. It's very brief mentions, but the purpose is very, very clear. And again, these are described as being part of the necessary beautification which a woman conducts for herself. Okay, this is private ornamentation. Now, none of this should surprise us, right? So men obviously are assumed to be hairy. Women, not so hairy. In fact, not hairy at all, right? So you've got soft, rough, strong, coming back to the other dichotomous. And notice how dichotomous it is, insistently, over and over again. There's nothing here to deconstruct the gender dichotomies. On the contrary, virtually every rabbinic comment you find wants to assure that the construction of the gender dichotomy is a very, very powerful one with a clear and high wall between the two sides of the dichotomy. Now, I want to add to that the final question which will lead us back to another part of our interpretation, and that is the question of a man's private adornment. Okay, so it's obvious that women have private adornments according to these texts. This I'm going to leave to you at least for a minute to consider. Well, if women have private adornment, maybe men also have private adornment. Anybody know, according to traditional Jewish sources, rabbinic sources, what a man's private adornment might be? Anybody want to guess? I know, your imaginations are going now, right? Right? It's not so hard, actually. It's not so hard. Listen to the following early midrash. This comes from the Mishnaic period. Right? Beloved are Israel, for Scripture surrounded them with mitzvot. It's always worth noticing when the rabbis use the word Israel, do they mean to include anybody but men? Right? So, beloved are Israel, for Scripture surrounded them with mitzvot. There are tefillin on their heads. Back to, right, men and, right? There are tefillin on their heads. And fringes on their garments. Right? So Israel has tefillin and fringes. That's what Israel means. Right? And with respect to them, David said, here quoting from Psalm 119, 7 times in a day did I praise you for your just laws. When David entered the bathhouse, he saw himself naked and said, woe is me, for I am naked of mitzvot. Right? You got it. Woe is me, for I'm naked of mitzvot. He saw his circumcision and began to sing praises over it. That's what this psalm, of the seventh day, right? Began to sing praises over it, as it says, for the leader upon the 8th, right? Meaning the 8th day of circumcision, a song of David. And now listen to the way the Midrash expands this. It may be compared to a king of flesh and blood who said to his wife, adorn yourself, that key word, adorn yourself in all of your adornments in order that you be desirable to me. Now, we always know that in the Midrash, if there's a king, the equivalent in real life is going to be, it's going to be God, right? And so if God is the king, then the wife here is going to be Israel, meaning male Israel, okay? So the Midrash goes on, so too did the Holy One, blessed be he, say to Israel, my sons, be distinguished by mitzvot. And here mitzvot means even when you're naked, and therefore circumcision, right? Be distinguished by mitzvot in order that you be desirable to me. So a man's private adornment, according to this Midrash, is circumcision, right? It's worth noticing. Coming back, well, actually, before I get to the more serious thing, it's not an accident that Yiddish used the word schmuck, right, for penis. Schmuck meaning jewel, right? Jewel, right? So adornments, right? The family jewels, that kind of thing, right? So that's part of the association here as well. So be distinguished by mitzvot in order that you be desirable to me. They have God the king imagining as saying to Israel the bride, Israel meaning being only the male bride though, right? Because females are not included in this quite obviously. Now we come back to the question of attraction. Think about it. So both men and women have adornments. Both men and women are meant to attract, right? But there's a very real distinction between the purpose of male adornment and what it is intended to attract, and the purpose of female adornment and what it is, or I should say who in both of those cases, it is intended to attract. So very obviously, a woman's adornments are intended to attract men, right? Preferably her husband, because if it's, beyond that, then we've got trouble, right? A man's adornments are intended to attract, at least private adornments are intended to attract God. Does what? The supernal masculine. You're getting a little bit too Kabbalistic for me, but I do understand what you're saying. And so you're actually answering the question I was about to ask, but I think quite appropriately, is it true, therefore, that what we're meant to notice is that, right, male is to female as God is to male, at least male Israel? Right? Does that make sense structurally? I think it does, which means, of course, that, okay, the female is intended to attract her God, right? Her husband, right? And by the way, for those of you who don't like the Hebrew of husband, Baal, right? Baal means master, okay? Husband means master, thank you. right? We use the same in English as we do, right? You herd animals. That's what a husband does, right? That's what husbandry does. So if you think Hebrew is more problematic than English, right, ain't true. It's all problematic, right? But now we notice that males also are intended to attract, but the assumption is that the attraction that males will do is toward God. This leads to one final text, which I want to share with you, which is, well, actually, it's the second to last, because there was a comment made before that needs to be filled in. In terms of attraction, I think this text is very important. This is for me, one of two of the most troubling texts on gender in the entirety of rabbinic literature. Okay, one of two of the most troubling texts. For those of you who want to find it, you'll find it in Tractate Sanhedrin, page 22b. I'll read you the translation, but the translation doesn't fully capture it. It says, "A woman is a formless being." Okay, the word in Hebrew is golem, right? You know the word golem, right? Like the golem of Prague, right? Right. So a woman, the Hebrew here is isha golem he. A woman is a formless being, and she makes a covenant only with the one who has made her into a vessel. That's the upgrade. That's the upgrade. Yes, again, she makes a covenant. Koretet brit, a not koretet brit, ella lemisha asa'a kli. She cuts a covenant only with the one who makes her into a vessel. In other words, takes her from being a lump of clay, that's what a golem is, into being a well-formed vessel, right? And this is obviously talking about her husband. Right, the cutting here of covenant is a literalized, sexualized description of what makes the marriage. But then it quotes a verse which is being understood in a very kind of indirect and perverse way, quoting from Isaiah. Right, I'm translating for the context. "For the one who masters you is your maker. The Lord of hosts is his name." The Hebrew here is ki bo'alayich osaich. Boel is the in rabbinic Hebrew, not in, it has this meaning in biblical Hebrew, but quite distinctly in rabbinic Hebrew, Boel means to have sex with, but that's because it means to master. So bo'alaich, you could translate either as your husband is your maker, bo'alaich osaich, or the one who first has sex with you is your maker or creator, right? The Lord of hosts is his name. Now, the fact that that's quoted in this verse makes the parallel that I suggested before, right, unmistakable. This is explicit, right? So, as God is to male Israel, husband is to wife, according to the assumption of this teaching, and, as we can see in the description of ornament, large other parts of the tradition as well. Now, where does all of this lead? Well, there are a lot of places it leads, and I'm interested in your responses and discussion, but I just want to share two brief things in connection. The rabbis, in reading this chapter of Shabbat, have two very interesting things to say. All right? First of all, with respect to the question of wearing and Shabbat, which was mentioned before, this is a Talmudic sage by the name of Ula, who says, reading our Mishnah, he draws the following conclusion. Therefore, Ula is of the opinion that anything that is fit for a man is not fit for a woman, and anything that is fit for a woman is not fit for a man. Right? So he reads the radical dichotomy of the Mishnah according to its full radicalness, and then in commentary on that, Rav Joseph says, and I quote, Ula is of the opinion that women are a people unto themselves. Am bifnei atzman, right? Am means people, like, the people of Israel, right? So am bifnei atzman, which is why you can describe Israel as being only male, because, again, in this context, right, you've got females, according to this interpretation, as being another nation. Now, I want to open up to discussion, but I do want to share one cautionary note in order to balance this out. On the one hand, I believe that everything that we just interpreted here is correct with respect to at least a very important part of the meanings of these texts. There is a radically dichotomous vision of masculinity and femininity and who is attracted to whom and the quality of what it means to be a woman and quality of what it means to be a man. All of it, right, constructed in the signs of gender. that we see worn throughout here. What we wear, right, is an expression of who we are, and they gender that, again, in a radically dichotomous way. But as those of you who have studied rabbinic literature know, it's always possible when reading rabbinic literature to quote this and that, right? Because one of the things that rabbinic literature is best known for is that differences of opinion are not only supported, but are often even celebrated. So for some of the more difficult things that I've quoted here, it would be very easy to also quote other things that, with respect to at least femininity in women and so forth, would be far more favorable. But having said that, let me only say that if some of what you've seen here, some of what you've heard for the first time, some of the interpretations that you've heard from us collectively with my support is for the first time, I think that's because there's all too much apologetic in the representation of all traditions, including Jewish tradition. And so, yes, I do recognize that part of what we're doing here is looking at some of what, from our perspective in the early 21st century, is ugly stuff, right? Meaning ugly about the tradition, but I'd rather avoid the apologetics and face the truth of our origins, because we can then work with it. And there's a lot of work to be done. I open it up to your comments, questions, observations. You can fight with me. You can fight with one another. Anything you like. Yes?
So, would you say that female slacks or pants are patterned after a male garment, therefore not permitted, based on what you just said?
Well, you know, there's the ideal and then there's the prohibited. That one midrash which I quoted, which asks what's the true meaning of the Torah's verse prohibiting cross-dressing, you know, there, as I said, it's actually not all that anxious about mere cross-dressing. What it's concerned with is that you might use cross-dressing to infiltrate the society of the other, if you're a male, to infiltrate female society, if you're female, to infiltrate male society. So the question is what you do with it. That's on the kind of bottom line level. Ideally, there is no doubt that they would want the differentiation, given what we've seen, to be far more, clear, distinct, and extreme. Having said that, it is at least worth thinking about the fact that, and this is something that I was working on this. One of the questions that I kept on coming back to was, to what extent does this merely reflect the social historical reality of what people wore? And so when you go back to, remember, Jews were living in an Eastern Roman province, right, in the period of the rabbis, 1st century, 2nd century, what we saw here in the Mishnah, in other words. And so the proper analogy, meaning the question of the reality you look at, is Roman dress in the Eastern Mediterranean for males and for females. And what you'll find is that dress for male and female in the Roman Empire more broadly, and certainly in the Eastern Mediterranean, was subtly different, not extremely different. In other words, the extreme dichotomy here also shocks when we compare it to, if you think of the various robing, the toga, and so forth. Ornament, jewelry, was an important part of the distinction, but men also wore rings and other parts of jewelry. This is far more extreme than what we see here. What you just described is actually more extreme even than the real world of male and female dress in Judea or Palestine of the time. Yes? It's a good question. In other words, how would the local Roman troops have felt about that, right? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, actually, I actually like what you're saying. Even though I don't agree with the analysis, I think it's right. What I mean by that is that there's the technical explanation. The technical explanation is that these actually count as adornment, but they're afraid they'll be removed, which is what you're saying. They just don't trust the women, not to remove these things. They're too.
I just want to say one more thing. There's a midrash about Sephora that explains why Miriam was stricken with leprosy, because Sephora goes to Miriam and complains that Moses' work life is leading to a lack of
Relationships. Yes.
That's what you brought with another suggestion of that.
That's right. That's right. No, but I think you're right. First of all, the question is a really good question. Is this just Jewish men imagining themselves as really macho, right? Look what I can wear, or might they actually, from time to time, have been permitted to wear these things? I don't know the answer to that. I would have to ask some of my colleagues in late antique Jewish history. Although it strikes me that you're onto something. Josephus, the problem is here we're dealing with the period following not just the first Jewish rebellion, right, the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, and so forth, but following, when the Mishnah comes to formulation, following the second great rebellion. So even if the Romans might have been relatively more tolerant, after the first rebellion, by the time we finish the second rebellion, the so-called Bar Kokhba rebellion, 133 to 135, there the Romans had no patience for anything, Jewish that expressed nationalism, power, all those things. So that might relate to the question, more complicating for your question, and I think you're pointing to it, is how do we date it? What period precisely? But listen, there's a lot of imagination going on here too. There's no doubt about that. Good. Yes? As far as I know, there is no Talmudic discussion of dress as part of the transgressive celebration that Purim in part is. It has always interested me that, Purim is the time when religious, dati, young men cross-dress. Right? It's worth noticing, and we should interpret it, but I don't know of any ancient discussion of it at all. Do you know of something?
No, I was.
Oh, okay. I thought.
I knew that halachically, as long as they keep their beard, they can cross-dress. But that's.
Yeah. Okay. I keep my beard on Purim. It's true. Okay. I just did one second. Right? Yeah. Everybody else, that's right.
Adopting the gender norm and the gender, dichotomy. So when we see these sort of very kind of hostile communities of rabbis, I wonder how much is just a reflection of the communities and lands that they lived throughout the ages. And I couldn't help but
it's a very good question. I would go two ways on it. I thought about that a lot in working on this as well. The two observations I would make is, first of all, the fact that the adornment dichotomy, which is described here, is more extreme than the actual sartorial reality out there. And so you have to wonder about that. It is also true that Roman law, which was, of course, the alternative, the system, the reigning system, but the local Jewish community was, to a very significant degree, had the legal right to conduct its own affairs according to its own law. But having said that, Roman law was what we, meaning from our modern perspective, would call more liberal or enlightened with respect to the status of women than rabbinic law was. Now, you might say maybe it's because the rabbis live not only in the Roman world, but also are inheritors of an ancient Near Eastern system, which had its own attitudes toward women and their proper legal places, and that's true too. I mean, so it's a complicated analysis. I hope I wasn't, I now hear how you may have taken it this way. I wasn't blaming the rabbis, I was blaming men. But having said that, I do think that compared to their immediate settings, the rabbis are more extreme. I think that is a correct description. Where that comes from, what you say is undeniably correct. Everyone lives in the context in which they live and is powerfully affected by it. I have no interest in blaming, right? I have an interest, though, in analyzing, and the reason analysis here might come to sound like a blame is, of course, because the rabbis did wind up legislating Judaism that would become mainstream Judaism in many, many subsequent centuries, which means that the attitudes here which become law, right, when attitude becomes law, then that has very concrete effect in terms of the social legal place, in this case, of men and women and the relationship one to the other. Having said that, I do have to say that before I came down here, I was preparing for a class that I'm teaching later this week and reading the chapter in David Beale's book, Cultures of the Jews, where there's a long description of Jews living in Renaissance Italy and their habit, along with everybody else, of men and women, hanging out in the bathhouses naked together. So it didn't mean the rabbis always won. The rabbis certainly were not happy about that. So there's real life in all kinds of periods that is different from the legislated reality. That's also important to say. On one level, what we're looking at here is not even how Jews who followed the rabbis may have lived. Right? It may simply be their ideal vision of what they believe the case ought to be, but then comes real life. This is legislated. It's not real.
These anxieties about gender and how it's going to be manifested in clothing that people wear, when does this start in terms of the individual life cycle? In other words, is there any idea about, do baby girls have to wear pink and baby boys have to wear blue, and as they grow up, are these distinctions only sort of activated after, puberty, or?
It's a good question. I don't know of any discussion of it. I've no discussion of it whatsoever. So I just have to say I don't know. Meaning, if you're asking me to describe what their attitudes would be, I have no idea. What we do know from traditional worlds is that, and there is something of this actually. I'll tell you how this comes up. I'm now thinking of a very partial response to what you're asking. In traditional worlds, children, male or female, tend to be dressed as females as long as they are in the female domain, right? So during the first few years of life, boys are dressed like girls, and then the question is, when do they begin emerging from the feminine domain and begin to find a place in what will become the male domain? So that relates to, when do boys first have their hair cut? Do they wear dresses or not? I love the pictures up at Hyde Park, of FDR, in the carriages, wearing dresses. Whoever, imagined, Franklin Delano Roosevelt wearing dresses. But of course, it makes total sense. What's interesting, though, is that Judaism had a slightly different calendar of socialization, of gender socialization, at least in certain details. So, of course, circumcision, right, is a male socialization ritual in a whole variety of cultures, which is usually associated with puberty. The fact that circumcision happens, not at puberty but on the 8th day, sort of complicates that, although it is clear, and there are a variety of people who interpret this, it is clear that even at birth, as a birth ritual or a close to birth ritual, it is assumed to be the entry of the Jewish male into male Israelitehood, or whatever word would work there. There are clear suggestions that a male who is not circumcised is not only not a good or fully formed Jew, but also not a good or fully formed male. But that's only a small piece of the much larger and important question that you're asking. Yes?
Can you address the
So tefillin, and what was the second? So what's your question? Well, I think that came up before. Why would they be talking about tefillin before? Here, the problem is that tefillin, is not a Sabbath garment, which is why you shouldn't be wearing it. That's quite true, although it is an adornment, and it is described. Tefillin is described as an adornment for males, which may be part of the explanation why tefillin is so, in the rabbinic discussion, so characteristically and unalterably male. It represents public malehood. It's about piety. The other thing which is interesting, if you think about it, is that male adornment, we didn't say this, male adornment is an expression of piety. Whether it be the private adornment, circumcision, or whether it be tefillin, feminine adornment is obviously not about piety either. That comes back to the other discussion. Yeah, exactly. It means, weaving in ribbons or the like into the hair. No. It's not the same kind of straps. Yes?
This analogy that you just told us is very interesting. Men are to women as God is to men.
Mm-hmm.
What are the different consequences of that you see? For example, with respect to, a number of things, but given this discussion with respect to modesty, do you think that means that explains why the responsibility of dressing modesty is more put on women than on men?
Because God can always see us anyhow, right? There's no such thing as modesty before God, as it were. Possibly. When you ask about its implications, you suggested one, but what's interesting is there's a real complicating factor here, and the question is how it relates. This is not about adornment so much, although it's implicit in a lot of what we've said about adornment, but about gender, and those implications. There was a book, now probably 25 years ago, written by someone who became a former professor of Jewish studies because of the radical work that he was doing. It was a problem for him to keep a job. He wrote a book which began with the recognition that in chapter 1 of the prophet Ezekiel, you see a very explicit description of God's body. Okay? From top to midriff and from bottom to below the groin. Right? And there's a kind of avoidance. You don't describe what comes in between. And the question is, why not describe it? So this particular scholar drew this, it was a study of what he described as the complications of Jewish maleness, because if God is a male and God is Israel's lover, that means that Israel, who as we saw is males, but relative to God has to be the female. So what does it mean that as a Jewish male you can only be a female with respect to God? Right? Now you're welcome. The book, I should say, was called maybe The Divine Phallus? Howard Eilberg Schwartz, if you're interested in it. Yes.
So I'm struck by the use of the word clean with regards to the woman in relation to the man.
Yes.
And given the
Clean meaning vessel.
right, but also meaning clothing. And maybe I'm getting a little too intertextual, reading too much, but in Amy's session we just saw in Yirmiyahu, there's an analogy of Israel to God's loincloth.
Mm-hmm.
As it were. So it just struck me that, in a sense, Israel, that is the men of Israel, are kind of, clothing God's loins. Maybe similarly, the woman is clothing the man's loins. And like when I heard cleave, my first thought was, a cleave, the land in which his seed is sown, blah, 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 blah. But I'm wondering if there might be something more to that.
Maybe. No, it's a good suggestion. I don't know. I've never heard, I thought of the association. What's interesting, the other possible association is Kli Gever Al Isha, right? I mean, the prohibition of cross-dressing from the Torah, the way it expresses itself, is that, a man's kli should not be upon a woman. The common understanding of that, I mean, vessel is one translation of kli. You're telling me that it's also clothing, right? And here it might be taken that way, but it's also taken to be more literally tools, or, so that would relate to war-making tools and armor and things like that. So a woman is made into a kli. I don't know. I only, since it begins with golem, right, an unshaped mass, like a lump of clay, and you work from a lump of clay into a kli, it's hard for me to see that as anything than, forming into a pot, right? And since, women were seen as vessels, repeatedly in cultures through the ages in that way, I don't see any way of avoiding it. Okay, any last comment or thought? Well, you're pointing in that direction, so where am I going? Oh, far corner, I'm sorry. See what you get for sitting in the far corner? No, yeah, go ahead. Why? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. No, a woman can wear a necklace, except that she shouldn't, according to this Mishnah, on Shabbat, because it's easy to take off. And if she removes it to show to her friend and say, look at this beautiful necklace I have, she then might carry it. Right? So the structure of this Mishnah is there's certain things which are bona fide adornment, right? But you shouldn't wear them on Shabbat because of the danger that you might carry them. Now, I want to come back to the observation that was made before. Can't trust women, can you? And I don't know. This is the rabbi's imagination. It's not reality. I don't know. Okay, I think our time is probably up. Oh, you know what? I've got a couple of really impatient. I mean, I didn't mean that. I mean, meaning you. Yeah, go.
No, I don't think you're being fair to the rabbis. They equally don't trust the man not to remove the sword and show off.
Well, the problem with the sword is actually more complicated, right? Oh, you're talking about Mishnah number 2. I mean, yes, they also have things. No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Actually, and Carol, this is the answer. You're absolutely right. There are other things that men might take off, and there is danger of their carrying. Well, tefillin doesn't quite fit into that category. Yeah, helmet or leggings, I think that works. That's right.